The U.S. airstrikes hit more than 4 locations in Syria, 3 in Iraq. What could be the next phase in what Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said would be a multi-tiered response? What more could we see in the coming days? Joining us now, Jeremy Bash, the former chief of staff to Secretary Leon Panetta at the Pentagon and the CIA. Also with us today, MSNBC military analyst and Medal of Honor recipient, Colonel Jack Jacobs. Jeremy, first to you. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said the targets were carefully selected to avoid civilian casualties. In fact, that was one reason why they were waiting for cloud cover to clear. What else could the Pentagon do? What else did they take into consideration when picking the targets? And why did they wait a number of days since last Sunday's killing, the deadly strikes that killed 3 soldiers?
Well, Andrea, I think everybody expected that the United States would have to respond militarily to the killing of 3 U.S. service members in Jordan. That really wasn't in doubt. But then the questions unfold. What would be the targets? What would be the platforms used? What would be the weaponeering? What would the United States say publicly about these attacks and about its effort to go after Iranian targets specifically? And what would we communicate both publicly but also privately to our allies and partners? And so that takes quite a bit of coordination. It's a highly complicated operation. The president just doesn't sit there and push a button and these attacks unfold. As noted in some of your setup reporting, some of the platforms used included aircraft coming all the way from Texas, B-1B bombers. These are large, actually nuclear-capable bombers. They're part of our nuclear triad. They can carry and hold much larger weapons. They can fly with weapons that have much more standoff capability, so they don't have to get right over the target. They can stay back because of air defenses or maybe political air rights that, for example, the Iraqi government might have been holding back. And so this was a fairly complicated, I think, comprehensive operation, well done, well executed, professionally executed. And this was the right level because we were going after Iranian targets, specifically calling out Iran as the author of all of this unrest in the region, including the attacks against U.S. service members, troops and bases, but not attacking inside Iran to escalate a wider direct conflict between the United States and Iran. So I think this was exactly the right level and well executed.
And Colonel Jacobs, what military assets were used in the U.S. response? Jeremy talked about the B-1Bs, but what about the significance of the weapons used as well?
Well, precision-guided munitions obviously is the way to go. There have been a lot of people talking about how we need to use dumb bombs instead, but there was a concern, of course, collateral damage. It's interesting to note that these kinds of weapons can be launched, precision-guided munitions, can be launched from a variety of platforms, including ships and aircraft that are located on ships in the region. But we wanted to keep those assets, aircraft carriers and the planes that carry them, and the planes that are on them, just in case there was some sort of escalation and those aircraft would be required to do some further counterstrikes. It's interesting to note that we have a very large target list that gets modified from time to time as intelligence dictates. So there are lots more targets there that we can strike, but have elected so far not to strike, because if we strike all of them, then we have nothing left to do except to really escalate the conflict, which the United States does not want to do, Andrea.
And Jeremy, let's talk about what could come next. A lot of talk about cyber being one of the things that could be done in addition to these strikes, which were kinetic. What are our capabilities in cyber, and whom would we be targeting?
Well, I suspect the United States, mainly led by U.S. Cyber Command out of Fort Meade, Maryland, has a range of options on the table. And they've probably been conducting operations against Iranian surrogates and proxies, both to collect information, but also ultimately to debilitate their command and control and their ability to operate. And so if cyber is part of the weapon suite, and in modern warfare, of course, Andrea, it always is, then undoubtedly, and if there are opportunities, then undoubtedly the U.S. will employ them. They have the benefit, Andrea, of being obviously less visible. Therefore, the United States doesn't have to explain them publicly, and they can be highly effective. But I think in this case, given the fact that Iran had been attacking our troops our bases, our personnel in the region, we were going to have to respond with missiles, with lead on target. There was no way that the President of the United States was going to be able to tolerate this. And though it took a couple of days and there was some grousing in Washington about why was it taking so long, I think, again, this was exactly the right response. I do think it's important to note, Andrea, just one final point here, which is that all of these attacks against America, our allies, our partners in the region since October 7th, this isn't a coincidence that Hamas attacked Israel, that Hezbollah has been attacking Israel, that the Houthis have been attacking ships, that Iranian proxies have been attacking American forces. This is Iran trying in the region to prevent Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States from doing a three-way diplomatic deal, which is what was on the table in the fall of 2023. And at this hour, 6 Americans are being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. Let's not forget, 6 Americans are being held. This is an attack not just against Israel. This has been an attack against the United States, against our citizens, against our people, our troops. And President Biden went to Dover Air Force Base to see the dignified transfer ceremony of 3 service members this week as a result of those attacks.
Those young service members, they're barely in their 20s, 2 women and 1 man. Their parents talking about their aspirations. It's the volunteer army. This was their career path to rising in society. And, of course, the 2 of them, the 2 women, were posthumously promoted to sergeant in what their mom said was very meaningful promotions by the president in his phone calls.